Welcome to Chapter 19. We have finally made it to the end of Unit 6, our time period 6, and Chapter 19 is lengthy. This is getting into the progressive reforms that will address the Gilded Age problems that we've been talking about throughout the previous chapters, and it's lengthy. So I will just go ahead and tell you that now. It is lengthy. There is a lot happening politically. We're going to cover quite a few presidents. There's going to actually be a new political party that comes in briefly, and there is a lot of policy change that comes about as a result of these progressive era reforms. So they're going to be looking at economic reform, political reform, social reform, all rolled into one. So let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 19. All right, so here we are. We've got Chapter 19 that is looking at this idea of politics and government and who's responsible for making these changes in society. And look at the time period that we cover here. So 1880, again, coming out of Reconstruction. And then 1917, what's unique about 1917? Well, this is going to be the point where the United States gets involved in World War I. So this is leading up to this idea of imperialism and then the world crises that come about with the World War. All right, so as we are looking at this, these reform visions that are going to occur during the time period, these are some of the areas that are going to be addressed, where they're going to be looking at cleaning up the corruption in politics, which we saw at the city level with Bois, but then also at the national level as well. We saw that with the control that the big businessmen had over the legislature at the national level. And then issues with the lower classes, working class, labor issues, and then also issues related to social justice and racial discrimination. So those are all kind of the areas that we're going to be talking about, and we can kind of lump some of these ideas from the progressive era into different categories. So I would definitely be familiar with this and maybe even take a picture of this particular slide, because these are going to be looking at some of the big items that come about with political reform, like civil service changes, which we'll see in a minute. Women's suffrage is going to be part of this, the Populist Party that comes about. Socially, we've already talked about the muckrakers, child labor laws come out of this. Prohibition is going to also be passed, conservation. And then economically, we'll definitely start dealing with some of those big business era concerns and put some regulations on these big companies like have never been in place before. All right, so we've got 4 main elections here that we'll be looking at in the early part of this unit. And so you'll remember the controversy in the election of 1876, which was the end of Reconstruction, and then the outcome, the disputed results in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Notice that they are colored here red for the Republican, and that's because of the compromise that was established in 1876, allowing these 1877, allowing these states to go for the Republican in that really close electoral vote count. And that in return gave the South what they wanted, which was the end of military reconstruction. So then if we fast forward here to 1880, we're going to see the development of James Garfield as the president. But look how divided the nation is in terms of region politically. The North and the Midwest all voting Republican, and the South all voting Democrat. So once again, this is where we're talking about, and I mentioned to you that coming after Reconstruction, we're going to see what we call the solid South. Politically, the South is going to always be voting for the Democrat, because by this point in 1880, those states have passed Jim Crow laws that are going to restrict the access of African Americans to voting. And those white Southerners are still very bitter over the outcome of the Civil War. And they are going to refuse to vote for the Republican Party, which they associate with Abraham Lincoln, and they associate with the change in the social dynamics in the South with the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction amendments. So then we move into 1884 and 1888, and this is where we start to see some changes here in the Midwest. And some of these other states, where if we're looking at Indiana, Indiana here goes for the Democrat, Grover Cleveland. But then in 1888, it's going to go for Benjamin Harrison, as we'll see in just a few minutes why that is. So these elections in the Gilded Age, we've not yet transitioned into the Republican Party, but these are really, really close elections. So let's start with James Garfield when he was president. This was again at the time where, when you're coming out of the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, which we know was full of corruption, and he had filled his executive branch offices with his friends, and there were big dreams for this one particular individual, Charles Guiteau, who was also a little delusional. And he was convinced that as he campaigned for James Garfield for president in this particular election in 1880, he was convinced that the only reason that Garfield was elected was because of his efforts in the campaign, and therefore he deserved a job in the government. Well, James Garfield never had heard of Charles Guiteau, had never met him, didn't know anything about him. And so this kind of gets into the delusion that Guiteau has in his mind. So when he shows up in Washington and he goes to the White House to have a meeting with James Garfield to find out which job he was going to be given, he didn't even get an audience with the president. He wasn't even able to meet with him. And that just kind of unravels him even more. And he's convinced that that Garfield is acting inappropriately, and that there's something wrong, and that he wasn't who the nation thought that he was, and he had to take matters into his own hands and save the country. So he ends up assassinating James Garfield. You can see the depiction here where they're at a train station and Guiteau comes out of the crowd and just comes right up to him and shoots him. And so you can see in this cartoon where it says an office or your life. And it goes back to the spoils system, as we've seen all the way back from Andrew Jackson. And here the White House, they're not giving him the job. And so in return, he is going to kill James Garfield. So then that brings about the outcome of this is going to be, people are starting to say, well, is this really a great system? Is the spoils system really a good way of getting the best and most talented people for office? And look what it has done with this crazed individual who has shot and killed James Garfield. So really the only noteworthy legislation that comes out of this new administration after Garfield has been killed is this law, the Pendleton Act, or the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. And this is going to mandate that executive office officials are going to also get their jobs based on merit. They have to pass a certain, competency test to make sure that they are capable of fulfilling those jobs. So it's shifting the government positions from being solely about who you know and who you are loyal to now being a little bit more related to merit. So the Pendleton Act is going to do that. So notice that we've got these people here: patronage abuse, ward boss. Again, these ward bosses, these people who are just simply connected to these politicians. The Civil Service Reform Bill is going to crush them, because that's going to limit their ability to get control of the government. Okay, so by 1884, we've got the next election that rolls around, and Grover Cleveland is going to be the candidate here who's coming into office, right? So if we go back and we look at what has happened here, so James Garfield has come in, and then the Democrat Grover Cleveland is going to replace him in the next election of 1884, because again, people are really disturbed by all of this corruption. And so again, look at how this plays out. So the Democrat Grover Cleveland is about ending the corruption. And the Republican candidate, James Blaine, is one of these guys who big business has him in their pocket. And the people know that. So there are some people in the Republican Party who end up actually voting for Grover Cleveland, and we're going to call them the mugwumps. So these are people who are looking at the morality of the situation and they are not going to be aligning themselves with James Blaine, who they know is somewhat corrupt, and so they end up voting for Grover Cleveland, and that gives them the election. So again, notice our definition here of a mugwump. So this is where you got the Republicans who are disgusted by the corruption, who will vote for the Democrat in the election because they view Grover Cleveland as the more honest of the candidates. So they're still Republicans, but they're voting for Grover Cleveland on more of kind of a moral issue in this election of 1884. So Grover Cleveland becomes the new president. And again, we can see here from one of these magazines. So this is a magazine title that you should be familiar with, because sometimes you'll see these cartoons in a DBQ or an SAQ of some sort, or maybe even a multiple choice stimulus. So Puck magazine, right? So here it is. Puck magazine is it's like a cartoon based magazine, but it's a political magazine, and they lean towards the Democrats. And so notice what they're saying here. The writing is on the wall. The Republicans are revolting. And so this is talking about the mugwumps who are turning towards a Democrat for his candidacy. All right, so Puck magazine comes out every week, and this is Joseph Kepler. So he and Thomas Nast are both the two really popular cartoonists of the time, and Puck is the Democratic magazine. So we've got Grover Cleveland, who is bringing in reform. And so what's kind of interesting is that these mugwumps are voting for Grover Cleveland, and they're some of the Republicans who voted for him, they did so because they were upset about the corruption in the Republican Party with big business. And so they started trying to dig up all kinds of dirt on Grover Cleveland. Well, what they ended up finding was that Grover Cleveland had a baby with a woman who wasn't his wife. And so you can see in the cartoon here where the woman is hiding her face in shame and the baby's saying, "I want my paw." And then Grover Cleveland, what is he going to do? Well, what ends up happening is Grover Cleveland, he owns up to it. He doesn't hide anything, and he supports the woman and the child. And the Republicans, their kind of slogan for the campaign to try to destroy Grover Cleveland's reputation is they say, "Ma, Ma, where's my paw?" And that's kind of reminding people that, he's not as moral as you would like, and trying to draw those mugwumps back in. But what ends up happening is Grover Cleveland wins anyway. So then the refrain is, "Ma, Ma, where's my paw? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So he ends up winning the election anyway. And this is where we start to see reform happen. Okay, so this is going to kind of be that transition where we're seeing more of the reform efforts at the national level. So the Interstate Commerce Commission, we've already talked about that. That's going to try to regulate the trains that are going across state lines. Workplace safety, again, coming after the fire at the Triangle Factory in New York. And so again, we see in the outcome here in 1884, where you have the Solid South voting for the Democrat. But notice that we have some of these these areas in the North that are also voting for the Democrat. And these would be the mugwumps. These would be traditionally Republican voters who are coming in for Grover Cleveland. Okay, so then if we look back here in 1888, the next president, you've got all these issues going on with Grover Cleveland. So then the next president who comes in is Benjamin Harrison. And he's the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the guy who was only president for like 30 days because he had caught pneumonia with his really long speech, that was in the rain on Inauguration Day. And Benjamin Harrison is from Indiana. So there's no accident in the Republicans' choice of Benjamin Harrison. So you remember William Henry Harrison was also from Indiana. He was the territorial governor there and fought the Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe and Tyler too, remember him? This is the grandson. And so he is from Indiana. And if we look back at the previous election, Indiana was voting for the Democrats. So the Republicans want to choose someone who can flip one of these states. And they end up doing so with Indiana and Benjamin Harrison coming in. And then also you've got New York that flips back as well for the Republicans. He promotes a high tariff. Again, that's going to protect big business, as we've talked about. But also during his presidency, the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to be passed. So this is going to limit a little bit of the monopolies that are forming, but we don't really see much of an enforcement of this at all. But the discussions now are starting to take place about, should the federal government actually get involved in regulating business, or should we remain as a true capitalist system with laissez-faire, hands-off approach to regulating business? So that's kind of where we stand with Benjamin Harrison. But then in 1892, Grover Cleveland is back again. But I want you to notice that there were actually 3 candidates in this particular election. This is where that third party, that new political party, starts to come in. And they're going to be known as the Populist Party. So their candidate is James Weaver. Notice the states that James Weaver is gaining votes. He's gaining votes in Kansas and Colorado and Idaho and Nevada. So out west is where this populist movement is going to start. So we'll be looking at those policies here in just a second. So Grover Cleveland comes back into office, and Benjamin Harrison will once again lose. So look, notice that New York goes back to Grover Cleveland. They weren't happy with Benjamin Harrison. Think about that Sherman Antitrust Act. So some of those businesses in New York weren't really happy about that. They weren't thrilled with Grover Cleveland either. But at any event, Grover Cleveland comes back. So he's the only president that we have who serves 2 terms, but they're not consecutive. So he was president in 1884. He loses in 1888, wins again in 1892. But the important part of this is the growth of the Populist Party. So the 2 names for the Populist Party, it would be the People's Party or the Populist Party. And it's going to be made up of kind of just a hodgepodge of different groups of people that are coming together. Okay, the Farmers Alliance. So as the labor unions in the Northeast, where these factory workers were organizing for collective bargaining, the farmers are going to kind of do the same thing, where they form their own alliances, where they negotiate as a group of farmers in a region with the railroads for rates or access or whatever it may be. And the Farmers Alliance is going to actually try to link up with the Knights of Labor, which would be these labor union workers, these factory workers, to create the People's Party. So they feel like they've kind of got a similar enemy of sorts, right? It's big business. So these big railroad industries, these big factory owners, you've kind of got the same problem with the same group of people of abusing their, in this case, the customers being the farmers, or in the case of the Knights of Labor, their workers. So the People's Party forms, and you can see here in the cartoon where you've got in Cincinnati, May of 1891, People's Party is formed, but it's the platform of lunacy. So this is someone who's saying, this is a crazy idea, bringing these groups together. And when you bring in the labor unions, look what they're trying to show. They're saying that the Farmers Alliance is here, but also the anarchists are there, and the socialists are there, and the Knights of Labor are there. And remember that they're starting to associate some of the violence that the labor unions were involved in. They're trying to blame that on these different groups of people. You've got the prohibition supporters, the socialists like Eugene Debs, the Free Silver Party. Remember, we talked about free silver and the gold standard. Who would have supported free silver? Who would have supported the gold standard? The businesses would have supported the gold standard, and then the lower classes would have supported free silver. So putting all of this together, this cartoon is saying the platform of lunacy. So again, if we're thinking about point of view, so is this cartoon supportive of the People's Party or critical of the People's Party? So they would be critical of the People's Party. So this point of view would be talking about and potentially exaggerating some of the radical ideas that are part of this movement. All right, so 1892, the People's Party, the Populist Party, is going to form. And they're also going to nominate James Weaver. So he's part of the Greenback Labor Party. This is again talking about opening up and freeing up money in the economic system. So they don't win the White House, but they do gain some of the seats in the House and the Senate. So that's going to start to influence and impact legislation that is passed. Okay, so if we go back a slide, again, remember where they carried some votes. So these would be farmers out here in the West. They don't really carry as many of these urban workers as they would have liked. So that's going to be something that they want to try to work on for the next election. So we've got the Populist Party with these general ideas, okay? So they are going to come together in a convention and they're going to write out their platform. What do we believe in as a party? And we're going to read part of this in class. So their platform, so this is the Populist Party platform, is called the Omaha Platform, where they meet at their convention. So look what it says. They want a stronger government to protect ordinary citizens. They want this idea of reform for the lower classes and not allowing the upper classes to just kind of run unregulated or in a corrupt way through the government. They want public ownership of the railroads and the telegraph system. So they don't want private companies to own these where they can, manipulate the prices and hurt individuals. If the public owns them, if it's like a public utility or something, then that's going to have equal access, equal rates that everyone will pay. Protection of the land from the monopolies and foreign ownership. So they don't want these companies coming in and buying up the land. They want a federal income tax on the rich. They want them to be paying more in taxes. And then they for sure want free silver. So these are the groups of people who are targeted: the farmers, urban workers, and then, these people in the newspapers in the Northeast start to say, who are these folks out in the West? This is crazy. And that's where we get that cartoon from before, trying to associate them with these radical ideas. All right. So once we've got this new party, now we need to start seeing how this plays out. So the 1890s are going to be fairly messy in terms of politics. But we have more people than ever before who are voting in presidential elections. But then look what starts to happen. After we get to 1900, things begin to decline. And part of that has to do with corruption. Part of that has to do with the disenfranchisement, as we've talked about before, of African-American voters. And we've got problems here with access to voting and just people kind of being disillusioned with what the government can do for them. And then the other big crisis here of the 1890s is an economic depression. And when the economy collapses, who tends to get the blame? The president does. So that's going to be part of this issue here that Grover Cleveland is going to experience, because they're in power in the 1890s. 1893 is when this depression is going to hit. So Grover Cleveland gets blamed for that. Remember, he's in office from 1880 to 1884. So that's why he loses in 1884. And they're going to vote for the Republican. The Republicans are also back in control of the Congress. And so they're able to put in their policies here in that first term of Grover Cleveland. But the economic depression is going to be part of the problem that the Democrats are going to face. Okay. So here again, we've got, anytime you've got an economic crisis, 1873, doesn't that kind of weigh in to why the people in the North were no longer willing to fund Reconstruction? It's because of their own economic difficulties. 1850s, we've got the same problem. And here we are in 1893, where this issue, the businesses are going to once again claim control of the government. So putting all of this together in terms of timing. So here is the economic collapse, but notice it's all happening right around some of these really dicey protests. The Homestead Steel Strike that gets out of control. So we talked about the wages that were being cut for various groups of people. And then the Pullman strike, where the railroads had cut their wages for the people. Part of that was due to the economic crisis. So again, when we talk about historical context or historical situation around which this strike was taking place and the wages were being cut, well, it's about the economic collapse in the 1890s. So the workers, when they're losing their wages and the ability, with the gold standard, not having a lot of cash freed up, workers begin to turn to some of these more radical ideas like socialism. And we can see from this, it's talking about step by step as labor begins to move, starting with strikes and then eventually getting into Bolshevism. That's going to be talking about the Bolshevik Revolution that is starting to kick up in the Soviet Union or in Russia at the time, and how that's going to lead us into chaos. So this is someone who would have been very disturbed by labor's connection in some ways with socialism. Coxey's Army, you've got high unemployment at the time. So these people out in Ohio, they feel like the government should start some sort of government program to build railroads or build canals or whatever it may be, and hire a lot of these unemployed workers. So Coxey's Army is going to march to Washington, D.C., demanding jobs. And the government doesn't hire them. The government doesn't have any money. They don't listen to what's going on with Coxey's Army. So again, as they march on Washington, they show up and the government just kind of turns a blind eye to these unemployed workers from the Midwest. And that's frustrating to these lower classes because, again, they don't feel like that their needs are being addressed at all. Later, when we get into the New Deal of the 1930s and we've got the Great Depression, that's one of the things that the New Deal does. The government creates all of these jobs that are going to be, building the TVA, damming up the river, the Tennessee River, and creating energy, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, where they do public works and build bridges, and they do all of these things. It's the government paying them. So ultimately in the 1930s, we do see a situation that Coxey's Army wanted for themselves in the 1890s, and they didn't get it. So they want the government to hire them, put them to work, pay them a salary so that they're able to support themselves and their families. So Coxey's Army, it doesn't happen. And when they march on Washington, they're met with a lot of resistance. So notice this bookmark, and they're tying Coxey's Army to the People's Party or the Populists. So how they ended up getting arrested is because they were on the lawn in front of the Capitol. And so notice that they've got this guy behind bars and it says, "Keep off the grass." So still pleads for the passage of his good roads and non-interest bearing bond bills now before Congress, which will reduce the hours of toll, give work to all the unemployed at not less than $1.50 per day for 8 hours. So isn't that kind of talking about a minimum wage? Improve the highways and all public works and issue legal tender money, not interest-bearing bonds. So they are making these demands and they're being ignored. So this is kind of concerning for some of those lower classes. And Grover Cleveland is not going to totally be on board with this idea of free silver. So we've still got this, this huge argument over free silver in the gold standard. Notice that the Capitol here is colored gold, referencing the gold standard and its support. All right, so the Democrats in the South are not going to really be on board with the populist either, because in some ways they view this as kind of a radical idea. So it's not for sure that these people in the South, these Democrats in the South, are going to align themselves with the populist. And look at the court case here, Williams versus Mississippi. Supreme Court approves the Mississippi plan depriving Black citizens of the right to vote based on a literacy test. That spreads throughout the South. So now you've eliminated African Americans from voting. And so the Southern Democrats are now in charge and in control in those deep South states. So look at how they take away the right to vote from African Americans. Some of it are going to do it by a state amendment to their state constitutions. That's what happened, here in Georgia. And then some are going to do it through a poll tax, where you have to pay a certain amount of money to be able to vote. That's going to be Tennessee, Florida, some of those other states. And then notice the population, where these counties have more than 50% African Americans in those counties. So a very small fraction of the population throughout these states and throughout these parts of states are actually able to vote because they have been blocked from it through these different methods. So you have white Southern voters firmly in control of the political system in these states. So 1896 rolls around, and the Democrats are going to nominate a new candidate, and his name is going to be William Jennings Bryan. And he is a name that you definitely need to be familiar with. He's never going to become president, but he's going to run multiple times, and he's going to lose every time. But he plays a key role in some of these elections and in some of these issues. So the Democrats are going to nominate William Jennings Bryan, 1896, and here are his goals for his platform for his candidacy. He believes in free silver. He wants to regulate big business. He wants the people to have more direct influence over electing their senators, because at this time, the 2 senators from every state were chosen by each state's legislature. The people didn't vote themselves on who they wanted for those Senate positions. And then they also want an income tax. So when we look at these statements of what William Jennings Bryan is supporting, do any of those sound familiar to anything that we just looked at? They sound exactly like those same issues that we talked about from the Omaha Platform, which was the Populist Party. All right, so now remind me where the Populist Party in the earlier election gained votes. They gained votes out in the West. If William Jennings Bryan is the Democratic nominee, what do we automatically know about where William Jennings Bryan is definitely going to get votes? He's going to get votes in the South. So the Populists have a decision to make. 1896, are they going to run another candidate to be a third-party candidate in addition to the Republican and the Democrat like they had in 1892 with James Weaver? Or if this guy, William Jennings Bryan, has the very same beliefs that they do, should they attach themselves to the Democratic nomination in 1896 and have a better chance of winning because you would combine those Western votes with those Southern votes? And that's exactly what they try to do. And the Republicans are worried. And big business doesn't want any part of William Jennings Bryan. Look at these policies. If you were a Republican and a big business owner, you would hate the idea of free silver. You certainly don't want the government to come in and regulate your business and tell you, anything about your production and your prices. You certainly don't want to pay any higher taxes. So you're going to do everything in your power to support the Republican nominee, who is William McKinley. And look at what he believes in, the gold standard, of course, because again, he's got the backing of big business. He wants a very strong tariff, which is going to tax imported products, protecting American businesses. And he's going to be financed largely by big corporations, just dumping ridiculous amounts of money into his campaign. And his campaign manager is this guy, Marcus Hanna. So he's going to be the one who is going around and really drumming up support among these business owners. So here we've got the platform, right? William McKinley, he is running on this idea of prosperity, strength of the economy, recovering after the economic crisis of 1893. And he is standing on a gold coin. So again, the foundation of his platform is the gold standard. And look who's holding him up, these wealthy people, and then some of these businessmen. I want to also look at, we're going to be looking at this speech more closely in class. In this campaign, William Jennings Bryan gives one of the more famous speeches in campaign history, and we call it the Cross of Gold speech. And he's talking about William McKinley and the idea of the gold standard, and he's going to be using these religious images in his speech. And the more famous phrase that comes out of this is it's something like, "You should not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns," right? So you should not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. Okay, this this cross of gold. So this we've talked, and the crown of thorns is referencing the idea of Christ on the cross. And so we've got the gold standard, and William Jennings Bryan, he was a Bible scholar. And so that's something about his background that you should know that kind of plays into the imagery that he uses in his speech. And so we've got this cartoon here where he is holding a gold cross, right? And it's used in Bryan's Chicago speech, the cross of gold, crown of thorns, used by Bryan in his campaign speech. And so again, he's using the Bible, he's using these references to try to make his point about how the gold standard would basically be tying the people, the common man, to this, crucifixion, that it would destroy them, is basically what he's trying to say. All right, so in the campaign, so again, William Jennings Bryan, he was an excellent speaker. That was what people knew of him, was that he was a dynamic speaker. They were drawn to what he was saying, but he talked a lot, on and on and on and on. And so here you've got him. Bryan is the ablest worker of sound money, that the more he talked, that this was actually helping William Jennings Bryan. So look at this campaign here. These are campaign contributions. How much money was spent in these campaigns from 1860 to 2012. Look at this election in 1896. And so this is, to try to make it relative. Money in 1860, you couldn't look at the actual amount of money and have an understanding of the proportion at which it was spent. So they're looking at how much was spent in the campaign based on the percent of GDP, which was the gross domestic product, which is like the productivity, or the amount of money that's produced through goods and services and that kind of thing in the United States each year. So if we look at this proportionally, I mean, this is just gross. The amount of money that is spent in the election, far and above any other election in history. And all of this money is coming from big business directly to William McKinley. So when big business is trying to promote him in their campaign, they're hoping that once he's elected and they've put all this money in his campaign, then he's going to pass policies that favor the business leaders and the Republicans. So here's the outcome. As we would expect, William Jennings Bryan carries the West. Typically had been the populist, right? So I brought this back in 1892. Here's the populist vote. So here they're going to gain votes for William Jennings Bryan because he's got the same beliefs, and he also carries the South. The difference is that William Jennings Bryan does not carry New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. He doesn't carry any of these strongholds anymore. And I think a lot of that has to do with the amount of money that big business was just pumping into this election and trying to play William Jennings Bryan out as someone who's going to destroy business. And he loses. So William McKinley is now president of the United States. There is some political reform that's going to take place. So when we start looking at changing the way we elect people, the direct election of senators is achieved, and that's going to be done through the 17th Amendment. So the way that we elect senators today, where everyone in the state votes on the candidates for Senate, that is because of the 17th Amendment. Prior to this, the state legislatures were responsible. All right, so again, this is where we've got more restrictions on who's able to vote, and that's going to allow the direct election of senators. Okay, some of the reforms actually get rejected by the Supreme Court. So we've got the income tax that is not going to be allowed. They say that the legislature, the Congress, can't create an income tax, that actually has to come from an amendment to the Constitution, which will come later. And they're going to strike down a lot of these worker protection laws and a lot of these limits to the work days and that kind of thing. So if we think about it, why would the Supreme Court really just be anti all of this reform? Well, we need to think back about how Supreme Court judges get on the court. Aren't they appointed by presidents? And they serve for their whole life. So the bulk of these judges who were on the court in the 1890s probably would have been appointed by Republican presidents, because if we go all the way back to Abraham Lincoln, there's only been 2 Democratic presidents since Abraham Lincoln. One was Andrew Johnson, who we don't even really consider because he was part of that, trying to bring peace between the North and the South. So Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, but he wasn't, really supported there. So a lot of these Republican presidents, there are judges that were appointed by Republicans that would have similar beliefs to them, would not have supported these ideas because it's restricting business in many ways. All right, so once we start to see a transition in the court is when we'll begin to see some of these reforms actually continue and stay in place. All right, so now let's move into this actual period of reform. And notice here I've got on the cartoon the White House, and there's Theodore Roosevelt with the big glasses and the big teeth. And he's kicking the old dictionary out, and he's got spelling reforms. So now we're going to be bringing in a lot of new policies. Okay, so here's what happens. In 1900, there's going to be a change. William McKinley is going to be up for re-election, and the people of the Republican Party in New York come up with a plan to add Theodore Roosevelt to the ticket to be the vice president under William McKinley. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that Roosevelt is a war hero by this time. He's from New York, going to be able to carry some of those votes, they believe. So again, look at what they're trying to play up here is the protections and the advancements that McKinley had made in 1896. So when he came in 1896, there had been a lot of Democratic ruin, and there had been an economic crisis in 1893. Foreign policy wise, we haven't gotten into this yet, but there's a lot of trouble that's brewing in the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. So then it's saying the promises that have been kept. So now that he's been in office for 4 years, you can see that there's a thriving business that's going on. We've got a run to the bank that people have money, and that there has been control restored in Cuba. All right, so let's look a little bit at this pairing between Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley. And Theodore Roosevelt is my favorite president because I think his story is just absolutely fascinating and unbelievable. So we've got they're playing up the prosperity here, a full dinner bucket, right? Everybody's got a job and everybody's got food to eat, and things are going well prosperity wise. So Theodore Roosevelt actually has a tie here to our area. So let me tell you a fabulous story for Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, so his connection to Roswell is through his mother. So Theodore Roosevelt's mother is this lovely lady here, Minnie Bullock, and his father is Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who is from New York. He's from the Roosevelt family of New York. And they meet, and Minnie Bullock and Theodore Roosevelt Sr., they meet, they fall in love, they get married right here at Bullock Hall. A lot of students, when we have prom and prom pictures and everything, a lot of folks take them here on the grounds at Bullock Hall. So let me tell you the story here of Minnie Bullock and Theodore Roosevelt Sr., and then how this plays into the future president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. So Minnie Bullock, she was kind of this, spitfire, very opinionated, but beautiful, beautiful girl who was growing up in this little small town of Roswell. So again, Roswell at this time was it was nothing. It was just very rural farming community. And Minnie Bullock's family had a lot of money. And a lot of times when these wealthy families, when summer would arrive, the rich people who lived in the urban areas wanted to get out of the city because of the spread of disease. And so they would go to the beach or the coast for the summer. And then a lot of the really wealthy families from the deep South in the summers would also go maybe to the beach kind of in the north. And so a lot of these families began to interact and know one another. So Minnie Bullock's older sister was dating Theodore Roosevelt Sr.'s best friend. All right, so you following that? And the best friend comes to Roswell to visit Minnie Bullock's sister. And while Theodore Roosevelt's here, he travels with this friend. When he comes here, that's when he meets Minnie Bullock, and for the first time. And, they're kind of curious about one another. And then later on, the friend and Minnie's sister get married, and they move to, I believe it was Philadelphia. And so Minnie goes to Philadelphia to visit her sister. Well, there Theodore Roosevelt Sr. is there visiting as well, and that's where the romance begins. So they have this long distance romance, and they're beautiful letters between the two of them. He comes to Roswell again to visit, and that's where they get engaged. And so the wedding takes place in December. Um, and I forget which year it was. It was in the, I believe it was 1850, may have been 56 or 58, somewhere in there is when the wedding took place in December here on the grounds at Bullock Hall. And so he whisked her away. They go to New York to live in the big city. And that's where they have their children. And of course, one of those was Theodore Roosevelt, who becomes president. But of all of the children, Theodore Roosevelt, when Jr., the one who becomes president, he was a sickly child, and he had a terrible, terrible case of asthma. And there was really no way of treating asthma at the time. And so what they would do, Theodore Roosevelt, he never went to school because his asthma was so bad. He had tutors who came to the house. So he didn't really play with other kids. He was kind of a loner, always by himself, and he was truly a mama's boy, right? So his mama protected him. He didn't, have a whole lot of friends. And every year in the summer, the family would go on these magnificent trips to get Theodore Roosevelt some good air. And they would go to the Alps for the summer, and they would travel around Italy, and they would go on all these fancy vacations. And a lot of it was involving trying to get him air so that he could breathe really well. All right, so one of the years they went on a trip to Egypt, and they rent a houseboat and they sail down the Nile River. And that was kind of one of the glorious trips that the rich and famous were known for at that time, was going down the Nile River in these houseboats. And so as they're sailing down, right here, they're posing for a photograph while they're on their trip. And so here's Theodore Roosevelt as a child, and he's on this trip in the Nile River. So if you look at him, he's probably 8-10 years old at that point, clearly hanging on to his mother, as he always did. And while he's on this houseboat and they're going down the Nile River, another houseboat kind of comes up alongside them, and it's full of all of these young college kids from Harvard. And they are basically kind of like on a spring break trip, but in the summer. And they are having a fabulous time. If you can imagine what I'm talking about, a group of rich fraternity brothers from Harvard on a houseboat for like a month. So you can imagine what Theodore Roosevelt is watching on that houseboat. And he says right then and there, I want to be just like them. I want to go to Harvard. I want to be in a fraternity, and I want to have fun just like that. And his mom and dad, Theodore Roosevelt's mom and dad, were like, yeah, you got to be able to breathe well first, right? You got to, we'll see, is basically what they said. So he was really curious, and he was constantly, investigating nature, and he would take and make these elaborate drawings of birds and things and different kinds of animals, and he would study rocks and plants and everything else. Well, he decided that if he was going to go off to college like he wanted to do, like those kids on the houseboat, then he needs to get stronger. So he becomes kind of, obsessed with exercise. And if he can train his body, then maybe his breathing would get better. So he heads off to Harvard, and he gets into Harvard. He goes there, and, he's never really been around other kids, as we talked about. So he wants to join a fraternity. Here he is with his fraternity brothers. And, of course they let him in because his last name is Roosevelt. So he gets in this very exclusive fraternity, but the guys don't really like him because he didn't know how to interact with him. He's just kind of awkward and quirky, and, they kind of ignore him, and they don't really like him, but they've accepted him in because he is a Roosevelt and he's got a lot of money, and his family has a lot of power. So he's really worried that the guys don't like him, and he wants them to accept him. So he decides the best way to get them to accept him is to go out and become a boxer on the boxing team at Harvard. He's never been, a boxer before, but he tries out for the boxing team, right? He's kind of this little guy. There he is on the front row here. He goes out for the boxing team, and guess what? He's actually pretty good at it. So he wins these boxing matches, and the guys kind of accept him a little bit more. Here he is in his boxing outfit, right? There's Theodore Roosevelt, kind of looking tough there. And he ends up making friends. And one guy that he becomes friends with is, they become buddies and pals. And as college kids do, right, they go back and forth to each other's houses. If you've got older brothers and sisters who are in college, my guess is that from time to time they bring their friends home with them. So this friend invited Theodore Roosevelt to go home with him to his house in Virginia for like a long weekend or something like that. And they get there, and when they arrive at the house, the friend has a sister. And she is the most beautiful girl that Theodore Roosevelt has ever seen in his life. And he decides right then and there that he wants this girl to be his girlfriend. Well, if he can't even, make friends with the fraternity brothers, he for sure does not know how to talk to a girl or impress a girl. So this whole weekend that they're there with at his friend's house, he tries to impress her, and her name is Alice. And so the lovely Alice, he starts literally trying to impress her by turning cartwheels in the yard. And she's like, who is this guy? He's pretty annoying. And then he tries to tell jokes, and she's like, he's ridiculous. Tells her brother, don't ever bring this guy back here again. Well, Theodore Roosevelt won't give up. Every single weekend he's like, when are we going back to your house? When are we going to your house? And so he keeps going back, and Alice is there. She gets to where she can tolerate him. And you know how sometimes when people are kind of pestering you to try to get you to like them too much, they're trying too hard. That's kind of what Theodore Roosevelt was doing. And one weekend they were there, and he was talking to her, and he was telling her all of these dumb jokes. And she was kind of annoyed. But you know how sometimes when things are just so stupid, it's kind of funny. And she was trying so hard not to laugh. But all of a sudden, she couldn't help it. She couldn't hold it in. So she started laughing. And at that point, she fell madly in love with him. He was madly in love with her, and they get engaged. Here she is, the lovely Alice. So there she is, Alice Lee, from one of the more wealthy families in America herself. So she's beautiful. Roosevelt falls madly in love with her, and they get engaged. So he graduates from college. He's going to marry Alice. By this point, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. has passed away, and Minnie Bullock has, she's living by herself in New York. And remember that, Theodore Roosevelt was kind of her baby. She protected him, through this whole time that he was sick. And now he's engaged to Alice. And so his mother, she's got to come up with a wedding present for them. So she buys them a beautiful brick brownstone in New York to live in, but it's right next door to hers. So she buys the house next door, has some slight renovations done, which would include busting out a wall and putting in doors that connect her apartment to their apartment there in New York City. So the lovely Alice, they get married, they move into the brand new house that Minnie Bullock Roosevelt has given to her son and Alice as a wedding present, right next door and now attached to her house. So things are going pretty well. And Theodore Roosevelt gets elected to the New York State legislature because his father had been in the legislature, and now he's being elected to the legislature. And the capital of New York is in Albany, New York. So he has to go away for a couple of months out of the year to go and participate in the legislature in upstate New York while they stay behind in the city. And by this point, Alice is pregnant with their first child, and everybody's so excited that the baby's going to be born. And so Roosevelt goes off to Albany to the legislature, and he's like, as soon as the baby's on the way, send me a message and I'll come right home. So the baby is born, but there are complications. And so Roosevelt gets back home, and Alice, the baby, it's a girl, looks just like her mother, has these eyes. See how striking her eyes are? The baby has those same eyes. And so the baby's born, but Alice starts declining, and they contact him. They're like, you got to get here as quickly as you possibly can. And he arrives back to New York City, and just in time, and his wife, she dies. It was I forget what kind of an ailment it was, but it was something related to her kidneys that the childbirth had and the pregnancy had made it worse. But in any event, she died unexpectedly, and the baby was only a day or so old. And Roosevelt is just absolutely distraught, right? This is the love of his life, and now she's gone, and he's got this brand new baby that he doesn't know what to do with. And then the family members, they're all just grieving, and they're all upset. And they come to Roosevelt and they say, you got to come to your mom's room. And so they go to Minnie Bullock, and she had been sick for a few days. Well, it turns out Minnie Bullock has, I believe it was tuberculosis or something like that, some disease, that was running through the city. And she dies within a couple of hours of Alice dying. So Roosevelt has now lost his beloved wife and his mother on the same day, within a couple of hours, in the same house. And it was Valentine's Day. So here in his diary, you can see what Roosevelt has to say. The light has gone out of my life. He's lost his mother. He's lost his wife. He is completely consumed with grief and is distraught. He doesn't know what to do. He's got this brand new baby. They named the baby Alice after her mother. And Roosevelt, he can't handle it. There's just too many memories, and he's just got overcome with grief. Can't function. So he goes to his sister, and his sister, her name is Bammy. And he goes to Bammy, and he says, she's an adult by now, but she's not married. And he said, Bammy, I can't do this. I can't stay here in New York City with all of these memories in this house. So will you take the baby, take care of the baby, raise the baby? I've got to leave. And she says, sure, I'll be glad to do that for you. And so Roosevelt decides, I think I'm going to be a cowboy. So he's decided, sight unseen, he buys a ranch out in the West. And it's a cattle ranch that he buys. It's in, I believe it's either in Montana or the Dakotas. It may be in the Dakotas, but in any event, he buys this ranch sight unseen, and he heads out there. He's now going to be a cowboy. Well, he decides, if you're going to be a cowboy, you better look like a cowboy. So he goes to Brooks Brothers Fine Clothing. You ever heard of Brooks Brothers? They still exist today. They make fine men's clothing. And he goes to Brooks Brothers and he says, I bought this ranch. I'm going to be a cowboy. Can you make me a cowboy outfit? And they're like, sure. How much you willing to pay? So they make him this cowboy attire. He gets some new guns and everything, and he heads out to his ranch. You ready to see his picture in his cowboy outfit? Here he is, his Brooks Brothers cowboy outfit. So he shows up on the ranch wearing this. So the real cowboys, you can imagine what they think. This guy from New York City with all of this money, and he shows up, wearing this crazy outfit. So of course they make fun of him, and it's time for the roundup. And so they assume that Roosevelt's going to kind of stay in the fancy lodge on the ranch. And he's like, no, I'm going out on the roundup with you. And they're like, what? You're going with us on the roundup? And again, they're making fun of his clothing. They go out on the roundup. They show him how to herd the cattle and how to rope the steer and all this stuff. Well, guess what? He's actually pretty good at it. So they still make fun of his clothing, but the cowboys, they really become close friends. And he works really hard out on the ranch. So he's out there for a number of years, getting over the grief, and the baby is still being raised by the sister. And by that point, Roosevelt decides, I'm done. It's time to go back to New York. So he sells the ranch. He comes back to New York. And when he gets back to New York, he is, in correspondence, there's some family friends, that have been writing to him, we're so very sorry about your mother and your wife and blah, blah, blah. And one of the family friends that has remained in contact with him is this woman named Edith. And Edith, her family and the Roosevelt family had been friends. And so she had kind of grown up with Roosevelt, and they had remained in contact. And when he gets back to New York, he and Edith get married. So they love each other. Things are great, but I don't know that it's truly that, just, incredible love like he had with Alice, but he was very, very happy with Edith. And they have all of these children. So here's the Alice, right? So the baby that her mother had died. So here's Alice. And then these children are all children between Theodore Roosevelt and Edith. Okay. So while he's back in New York, he's married now and he's starting his new family and he's got to have a job. And he says, I think I want to clean up all of this corruption here. Remember Tammany Hall? Remember all of the corruption here with Boss Tweed and all this stuff? This is all kind of going on here at about the same time. And he says, I want to be part of that cleaning up this police force. This is ridiculous. So he decides he's going to become the police commissioner of New York City to try to clean up the corruption, right? What better way to catch a police officer who is engaged in illegal, corrupt activity than to kind of disguise yourself and sneak around at night, and he would catch them doing all of these things. So here he is as the police commissioner, right? They've got all their bicycles to track down all the bad guys in New York City. And there's Theodore Roosevelt leading the police force. And he does a pretty good job of it, right? We kind of are seeing a theme here where Roosevelt gets involved in these situations and he ends up doing a really good job. So he's the police commissioner for a while. Gets kind of bored with that, and again he would come up with all these elaborate disguises to go undercover to catch some of these corrupt activities that were going on. So he does this for a while, and then his whole life he has heard stories about his uncle, Minnie Bullock's brother, James Dunwoody Bullock, who was in the Civil War and was a blockade runner, and he was he was involved in all of these shipping escapades in the Navy in the time of the Civil War, and he was just fascinated by it. So Roosevelt leaves the police commission, and again, he's got a pretty powerful name of Roosevelt, and he gets himself appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So here he is, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So this is kind of overseeing the naval force. But again, as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, how much true power does he really have? Not that much. But guess what? The Secretary of the Navy suddenly becomes very, very sick and ill and can no longer perform his functions in charge of the Navy. And so Theodore Roosevelt is now in charge of the naval force. So at the time that he's in charge of the Navy as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the Spanish-American War breaks out. Right. And we'll be studying that here in our next unit. But when the Spanish-American War breaks out, it's going to be fought down in Cuba. And Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, of course, he's going to have a pretty key role in this particular conflict. But he doesn't want to be stuck in Washington, D.C. behind a desk. There's a war going on, right? This is exciting. He wants to be right in the middle of all of it. So he resigns his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and decides that any war needs to have a really good cavalry unit. And if you think about, a cavalry unit, it would be the soldiers who fight on horseback. So he's going to put together this cavalry unit. It's going to be called the Rough Riders. And he's going to be in charge of it, of course, but he's got to kind of put together his soldiers who are going to be fighting with him in this cavalry unit. So guess who he calls up to say, there's a war going on. You want to be part of the cavalry unit. He calls up his cowboy friends, right? So from when he owned the ranch, he calls them up. I'm putting together this military force, this cavalry unit. You want to join me? They say, of course, we would love to serve with you, Mr. Roosevelt. But that's not enough people, So the other group that he puts together in the Rough Riders are his fraternity brothers from Harvard, who were all polo players. And so they're good horsemen as well. So he's got the cowboys mixed with the Harvard fraternity brothers who play polo, all being led by Theodore Roosevelt into battle. Can you imagine? Well, if you're going to go into battle, you better have a great uniform. So he goes back to Brooks Brothers and he says, I'm going into battle. I need a fabulous uniform for the cavalry. Can you make one for me? And they say, of course, we can make one for you. How much are you willing to pay? So, of course, he pays a lot of money. He gets his uniform and he goes and he fights in the Spanish-American War. So he forms the Rough Riders. Here's his uniform. You may have seen this depicted in Night at the Museum. So that's kind of where this is all coming from, is when he's leading the Rough Riders into battle in the Spanish-American War, and he's posing with his fabulous Brooks Brothers created uniform. So as we'll see in our next unit, the entire Spanish-American War only lasts a little over a month. They get down to Cuba. They've got the Spanish forces, and the Rough Riders are going to go into battle, and they're going to fight at San Juan Hill. And it turns out that the Rough Riders are the ones that force the Spanish to surrender. And so the hero becomes Theodore Roosevelt. And so again, when he goes into battle with his buddies who've made up this cavalry unit, he doesn't just stay in the back and say, y'all go fight. He's right in the middle of it. And, you know, bullets are whizzing around him. He doesn't get hit. He survives it, and the war ends. And it's because of the Rough Riders getting control of San Juan Hill, forcing the Spanish to surrender. And so out of all of this, Roosevelt is depicted in the newspapers as the hero of the Spanish-American War. So there they are, Roosevelt leading them. And you've got this motley crew of people made up of the fraternity brothers and the ranch hands from his cowboy days. And they're successful. So when he goes back to New York, right, he's going to play up this military hero status, and he gets himself elected governor of New York. So now as governor of New York, remember when he was kind of on this crusade, this kickback when he was police commissioner to clean up the corruption? Well, now that he is governor of New York, he's going to kind of do the same thing, but at the state level, not just the city level. And he starts to kind of go in and start to kind of clean up the political machine. He's going to kind of start to put a few little regulations on the businesses. And the Republican Party are, you know, of which he is a part of, he's a Republican. They're like, Roosevelt, man, what are you doing? This is, you know, your social class, the upper class, and you're trying you're kind of putting restrictions on us. So he gets himself elected, and he is going to go after a lot of this corruption with the same sort of, you know, arrogance almost and an aggressive nature as he had in anything that he had ever done. And he didn't really care who got in the way. So that really angers many of those New York Republicans. All right, so now let's back up to 1900. And this is the year that McKinley is up for re-election. So you'll remember that McKinley is a Republican. He's got a lot of support from big business, and he's up for re-election. And so the New York Republicans hatch a plan, right? What better way to draw votes than have a war hero on the presidential ticket? So the New York Republicans convince William McKinley to bring in Theodore Roosevelt as his vice president. Now, the New York Republicans, they know that as vice president of the United States, he can't also be governor of New York anymore. So that would get Roosevelt out of their hair, keep him from regulating the businesses in New York. And how much power does the vice president have? Zero, right? Unless something happens to William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt is going to be left powerless. And so the Republicans of New York, they're just dying laughing when Roosevelt becomes the vice president running with William McKinley. So they are running for president. But guess what? As soon as McKinley is elected, he gets assassinated within a few months of being inaugurated in 1901. The election was in 1900. He takes the oath of office again in 1901, and he gets assassinated. So now Theodore Roosevelt is president of the United States because these Republicans had hatched this plan to strip any sort of power away from him. So suddenly, he's now the most powerful man in the country. So it completely backfires. I love this political cartoon, right? So the Republicans in New York, they feel like they're laughing. You know, you've got these big business leaders and they're laughing because they've taken all of his power away. But then suddenly, look, they're begging Roosevelt, who now has all of the power, to have mercy on them and not undo their political and economic power. So Roosevelt's now in the White House. He does make a trip back to Georgia here to visit his mother's childhood home. while he's president of the United States. And this was huge, huge news. And this is the photograph that's taken when he visits Bullock Hall here in Roswell. And what I love about this picture, so here's Roosevelt and here's Edith, and they're on the front steps of Bullock Hall. But notice who's standing closest to the president. You've got these Black women and Daddy Williams, who's over here on the right, and Mom Grace, who is to his left. And they had been enslaved by Minnie Bullock's family when she was growing up here at Bullock Hall. And of course, the Civil War had ended, but these individuals still lived in Roswell at the time. And when the president came, that's who he wanted to meet. He wanted to meet these people who had known his mother as a child, and he wanted to hear stories about his mother. And they were happy to do it. So they met with the president, and he has his photograph taken. Now, all of these folks in the back, these are all dignitaries from Atlanta and the state of Georgia. He really doesn't care about talking to them. He wants to talk to these people who had been part of his mother's family as a child. All right. So, I mean, it's just, I mean, isn't this just the craziest story? So all of these jobs that Roosevelt has had leading up to him being president, and everything's always kind of worked out in the way that he's wanted to. And he's really just kind of over the top in everything that happens. So his personality, I just love this picture in the middle. I mean, that's just personality for sure. The Wright brothers invent the airplane during Roosevelt's time. And of course, as soon as they invent the plane, he's like, I want to ride in that. So he goes, and here he is riding in one of the earliest airplanes. He goes on safaris. Here he is. He shot an elephant while he was on safari at one point. After he's president, he and one of his sons, they go on an expedition to explore and map the Amazon River. Nobody knew where the Amazon River went. They knew where it started, but they didn't know where it ended. And he's like, I'll go on the expedition. So they go exploring, and they're nobody's heard from them for months. He gets malaria while they're on the expedition in the Amazon. He's almost dead. He tells his son, just leave me behind here. I'll die in the rainforest. And his son's like, no, I can't do that. And so they drag him out. Well, he lives, he survives malaria. Unbelievable situations that he gets himself into. All right, so here is the situation surrounding McKinley's assassination. Leon Solgas, who is an immigrant here, he's an anarchist. He is anti-government, and he gets access to the president, right? This big business, this abuse of labor and all of that. He's going to take matters into his own hands. So at one of these meetings, the president would have like a receiving line, and people would come through, and he would shake hands with them and that kind of thing. And it was in the summer. So it was really hot, and people were, wiping the sweat away. And so Solgas had his gun wrapped in a handkerchief, which wasn't that unusual because people had their handkerchiefs out to wipe the sweat, but it was really a loaded gun. And so when he gets up to the president, he just steps right in front of him, shoots and kills him right there. So this is McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt comes in as president, and he uses this platform as what he calls the bully pulpit. At this point, we've really thought about policy at the national level being directed by Congress. They're the ones who are kind of creating the policy and pushing it through. Think about Henry Clay and all of those policies. They're coming from the legislature, not as much from the president. Roosevelt claims that power back. And if we think about all of these presidents who've come after Abraham Lincoln, none of them really stand out for having done a whole lot. I mean, you've probably never even heard of Benjamin Harrison or Chester Arthur or Grover Cleveland or all of these guys. There's not a whole lot of policy that has come down for many, many, many decades. And the Congress had taken that power. Well, Roosevelt takes that power back, and he is now the driving force behind all of this progressive reform. And he calls it his square deal, right? And so by a square deal, he's basically talking about if you're dealt a hand of cards, and if you are playing cards, you deserve to be playing cards fairly. So if you get a bad hand of cards, but it was dealt to you fairly, then that's okay. But if you get a bad hand of cards because somebody else has cheated, then that's where something has to change. And so he's talking about no corruption. A square deal basically is talking about a fair deal. So look at what he's saying. A man who is good enough to shed his blood for the country is good enough to be given a square deal afterwards. So that would be the soldiers from the Spanish-American War, these lower class people who have been serving in the military. He says they all deserve to be treated fairly by the government. One of the earliest indications where we see this transformation of the government now siding with the labor force rather than big business is with the coal strike of 1902. And I would emphasize this in your notes as being the turning point, because up until this, every single time that there has been a dispute between labor and business owners, the government and the military have come in on the side of the business. So the coal miners went on strike because they had wanted shorter work hours. They'd wanted safer conditions in the mines. They had, their pay was not what it should have been. And so they were demanding more. And the coal mine operators were refusing to give in to their demands. And so the coal miners went on strike. But at this time, coal is what was used to fuel all of the homes and the buildings in the United States. It was coal driven, and winter was approaching. And if the coal miners stay on strike, there's not going to be enough coal to heat everybody's homes. So Roosevelt takes matters into his own hands. He calls the head of the miners' union to the White House. He calls the owners of the coal mines to the White House, and he sits them down. And he says, you all need to work this out. And if you don't work this out, and if there's not a compromise, and you refuse to work, and you refuse to give in to their demands, then I'm going to take over the mine and do the work for you, mine owners. So think about what he's saying. He's claiming that he's going to use the military, and he's going to use his power and authority as president to take control of a privately owned coal mine. Now, does he really have the authority to do that? No. But do you have any question in your mind that he would be willing to do it? Given everything that he's done in his background, of course, he would take great pleasure in taking control of this coal mine. So they negotiate a settlement, and it's largely because Roosevelt kind of sits them down and forces them to do it. And they do get not the full pay raise that they wanted, but they get some. They get a slight reduction in hours, and the coal mine is in operation again. So this is an indication where Roosevelt has stepped in on the side of labor. They didn't go in and crush the strike and force them to work again. He forced a negotiation for the businesses to give in. So this is the first time that we see the change where progressive reform in this coal strike has seen the government now side with labor. All right, so Roosevelt gets elected in his own right here in 1904. And again, a lot of his policies are very similar to those that the populists had wanted, and restricting the businesses and everything. So look, he gets all of these populist votes in the West. So why doesn't he get that vote in the South? Well, it's because he's a Republican. So he still gets the votes in the North, largely because the Northerners know that if they vote for a Democrat, that it's going to be even worse. So he gets those votes, but he's largely elected on the votes coming out of the West. So the South is still not voting for Roosevelt because they refuse to vote for a Republican who they still associate with Abraham Lincoln and the bitterness over the loss in the Civil War. Okay, so some of his reforms here. We've got the Interstate Commerce Commission that had been formed previously, but now it's going to be given some authority. So these two laws, the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, and I'm not terribly worried that you know the difference between these two laws, but I would know that both of them are going to regulate the railroads. So these railroads that were charging these wildly ridiculous prices and unfairly to different passengers at different points, this is going to regulate the railroads and limit how much they can charge and make sure that all customers are being given a fair rate, okay? And then now the Sherman Antitrust Act is also going to be given more authority, and monopolies are going to start to be dissolved. So this is the beginning of progressive reform under Theodore Roosevelt. Railroad regulation, and we're starting to see antitrust legislation, right? So there's the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act. Okay, so Roosevelt's objective here in busting the trust, we're going to start calling this trust busting, where these monopolies, where you've got horizontal integration, predatory pricing, all of these strategies that they've been using to eliminate competition. Roosevelt believes that that hurts consumers, that these prices are being unfairly manipulated. So he goes in and he begins to bust trust, but he does it in a way that is going to go after those businesses that have unfairly developed their monopoly, right, using predatory pricing. Now, if there is a business that is the only one in that particular market segment, why would you break it up? If they've come into being the most powerful company and all of the other businesses get absorbed by it, but they've done it in a fair means and not through predatory pricing, Roosevelt doesn't want to destroy those, because Roosevelt also looks at the production coming out of these companies, right? They're huge companies and they've got all of this production. And with mass production, you've also got a little bit of a lower price in some of those products, and we're exporting all of this. So if you break up every single trust, then you're actually going to go too far and hurt the economy at the same time. So he distinguishes between good trust and bad trust. A bad trust is one that has become a monopoly through unfair business practices. A good trust is one that has become a powerful large company because of good, solid business practices and good products that are done fairly. All right. So please keep in mind that he kind of has this. He's going much more so than Republicans had ever done before in regulating the business, but he's doing it in a way that is not going to destroy every big business. Okay. So he is going to bust 44 of the trusts during his tenure in office. Okay. So here's his distinction between good trust and bad trust. And notice this cartoon. So he's got the White House in the background, and he's got his rifle, because again, remember, he's this great hunter and all of this. And there are bears, and he has killed the bad trust, but he's got the good trust on a leash. And notice that it says restraint. So this is again distinguishing between this one is dangerous and this one is okay. So we're not going to go after this business and destroy it. So why the bears? Well, you've probably somewhere in your life had a teddy bear, and the teddy bear is named for Theodore Roosevelt. And it gets its name because once Roosevelt was president, he did go on a hunting trip, and he was going to be hunting bears out in the wild. And of course, anywhere the president goes, there's a lot of press that follows. And the first day that they had been out hunting, they didn't even see any bears. There wasn't any sort of success. And they were worried that the people who travel with the president and everything were worried that he was disappointed in the hunt. So overnight, they had found these bears. They had tracked these bears, captured them, and had tied them to a tree so that the next day when Roosevelt went out hunting, he would be able to actually shoot one of the bears that had been tied up. And Roosevelt was horrified when he saw this, and he demanded that the bears be let go, the little baby bear be let go, because he's like, that's not a fair fight, right? If you've got the bear tied to the tree, that's not the sport of hunting. Forget the fact that he has a gun and the bear doesn't, but whatever. He said that that was not, fair practice in the sport. And so these newspaper reporters witnessed him demanding that the bear be let go because it wasn't the fair sport of hunting. And they were just kind of shocked by that. And so they reported it, and it kind of became a thing where these stuffed bears were symbolic of Roosevelt's representation of the fair fight. All right, so we've already talked about the book, The Jungle, that he read, and he was obsessed with cleaning up the meat industry, and we get the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. So we've already talked about that quite a bit, and the agency that's part of this is the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. His role in the environment, he was a rancher for a while. He understands the needs of people out in the West and protecting the environment. So he sets aside, with the Antiquities Act, he sets aside sections of land in the West to be protected from commercial buildup or railroads going through or what have you. But again, he does kind of get at odds with John Muir. You'll remember that John Muir was the preservationist that wants to leave it completely pristine and untouched. Roosevelt was a conservationist, and so that does kind of rub John Muir the wrong way, but both of them were about protecting and managing the environment. So here they are out in the redwood forest with the giant trees out in California, and he's just, really wanting to protect these these treasures. All right, so Roosevelt finishes up his second term here. You remember he filled in most of McKinley's first term, and then he was elected to his own term. And so he decides that he wants to step down. He's going to honor that two-term tradition. It's not something that he had to do, and he probably could have gotten elected to a third term, but he just, he wanted a break. And William Howard Taft had been one of his close advisors in the executive branch throughout his presidency, and then, as we'll see in the next unit, had really helped in the Philippines after the Philippine War during this time of imperialism. And so Roosevelt handpicks his successor, and he says, Taft is my guy. Taft is running for the Republican nomination. I want him to win. He's going to continue on my policies of, anti-corruption, business regulation, the environment, all of these things. He's going to continue all of those policies. So here you can see in Puck magazine that that's the plan, that Taft is going to be kind of the nursemaid taking control of Roosevelt's policies while he leaves the White House. So Taft gets elected, as we would expect. We've got the North and the West, for the most part, are carrying on the tradition of voting for the Republican. But William Jennings Bryan comes back into the game again. So here's William Jennings Bryan running for the Democrat. And so he does carry a few of these areas in the West. Remember that Populist Foundation going for William Jennings Bryan. But bottom line, William Howard Taft is elected. You may know him or have heard of him because he was indeed our largest president. He weighed in at well over 300 pounds. And the story goes that he got stuck in the bathtub. I don't know that he got stuck as much as it was just uncomfortable. So he had a much larger bathtub installed in the White House. And here it is on display. To give you an idea of scale, there is the faucet. So this is a gigantic bathtub, almost looks like a hot tub, in terms of its size. So Taft comes in as president, but guess what? He doesn't follow the policies exactly like Roosevelt would have wanted. So instead of having good trust and bad trust, Taft goes after all of the trust. Okay, he feels like this type of progressive reform will make him more popular with the people, but instead it makes them angry. So he in one term he busts more than double what Roosevelt busted in 2 terms. So he goes after all of these big companies, destroys them, breaks them apart. So that kind of hurts U.S. production for our exported products. It hurts our ability to get products into the market because he's gone after all of these and hasn't used moderation in the way that Roosevelt did. Okay. He also is going to start messing with the tariff, which is something else that Roosevelt is very, very angry about. So Taft puts in place the Payne-Aldrich Act, and it is not as strong of a tariff as the McKinley tariff had been. And so that's going to be a problem. Okay, so we start to see some grumblings in the Republican Party about what is Taft doing, right? This is not necessarily lining up in the way that Roosevelt would have wanted. All right, so here we've got the elephant, and you'll know that the elephant is the mascot of the Republican Party. And the donkey is going to be the mascot of the Democratic Party. So anytime you see an elephant referenced in a political cartoon, it's talking about a Republican. And then these initials, GOP, stand for Grand Old Party, which is the nickname of the Republican Party. So notice that we've got tied to the elephant's tail here, fake tariff reform. and they're going to light this match and getting ready for the 4th of July, a mean trick to play on us, an unsuspecting elephant. And so it's all going to blow up on William Howard Taft. So the progressives promote more in the legislature. They start to promote more of their political reforms, and they're going to make the government allow the people to have more control over the political system. We've already seen that with the 17th Amendment. So these are more progressive reforms that come in, and that is going to make government officials who are elected are going to be more bound to what their constituents or the people who elected them will want. Okay. One of the reasons for that is from this terrible disaster that occurred. A hurricane went through Galveston, Texas. It's right there on the Gulf Coast. Not terribly, I mean, it's down a little bit farther south than Houston, but it's right on the coast. Terrible hurricane comes through. And this is before the time of being able to predict when the conditions are right for the hurricane to come in. We don't have construction codes and building materials that are able to withstand these high winds. So everything is destroyed in the town. You can see the only thing standing there is the church. Excuse me, and everything else has been leveled. And so they're cut off. Their water supply is cut off. Their communications are cut off. And the people are desperate. There's, mass casualties and deaths that come out of the hurricane. So the the people of Galveston, they send word to the governor. Look what they're saying. Send military supplies, firearms, animal and human food. Danger, food riots at any moment. The situation is horrible. I can't even describe it. For God's sake, help us. So things are really, really going poorly in Galveston. And what they end up doing to try to get through this crisis is, instead of having a mayor who may not have any sort of knowledge of how the police force operates or the fire department or the hospitals operate, they have what's called a county commission, or a commission was formed in Galveston, where the head of the police force, the head of the fire department, the head of the hospital, the head of the water department, they all come together and they govern the city to get through the crisis, to manage their resources as best they can for as many people. And other cities around the United States start to look at what Galveston has done to try to deal with this horrible, horrible disaster that's occurred. And they're like, that's not a terrible way to govern. So maybe we should put this kind of commission together now before the crisis comes about. And so that's going to be kind of a way of transforming local government. Here in Cobb County, we have the Cobb Commission, which is kind of along the same lines as the way that Galveston operated. Some of the other election reforms are going to happen as a result of this man, Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. He was a populist. He was someone who was wanting the people to have more of a say-so instead of just the elites. And he gets these progressive reforms passed, and you need to know about them. One in particular is the primary system. And the primary system is how you choose within your party who the candidates will be. Prior to this election reform, the party leadership just got together and determined whose turn it was, right? Remember, we talked about Henry Clay was so disappointed when the Whig Party decided, to go with somebody else in place of him in the election. So this is actually putting this into the hands of the constituents, the voters themselves. So anyone within the party who wants to run just throws their hat in the ring, as it's called, or throws their name into the running, and the people, the voters, will vote in the primary system. So in this past election in 2021, we had the Republican incumbent, Donald Trump. But then we also had the Democrats, who we had all kinds of people, tons of people who were running to get the Democratic nomination. So during the spring and early summer of 2020, we had primary elections, and that's where the people went to the polls. And then for each state, they would have delegates who would go to the party convention in the summer and cast their votes to figure out who the nominee would be. So if we go back, the last time that we had not an incumbent running would have been in 2016. And so you had a Democratic primary, you had a Republican primary, and all of these people at some point said that they wanted to be president from the Republican Party. And so they had debates, they campaigned, and they had these primary votes in the various states. And then after, a number of states, if you're not getting a certain number of votes, normally those low vote getters will bail out of the primary, and then they'll say, well, I support this person. And over the course of the primary system, it turned out that Donald Trump became the Republican nominee. And then in 2016, Hillary Clinton became the Democratic nominee. And so at that point, then you go in November to the general election to choose between these two candidates. But the primary system was established as part of progressive era reform in the early 1900s. So we vote not all on the same day, but now we've got Super Tuesday, which is in March, and all of these states in red, they vote all on the same day. The earliest voting is in February. You've usually got the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. So these are some of the earliest states that will vote that kind of give us a sense of who might be in the front running. All right, so the primary ballot, again, you've got the Republican nominees and you choose between them. Okay, the other way that progressive reform is going to give more power to voters and constituents would be through these two provisions, initiative and referendum. And they go together. So there is a way for the people to actually pass policies that don't actually go through the legislature. Think about if there was some law that was needed that would restrict the legislature in some way. They might not ever vote for it. So there's a way for the people to do that. An initiative is where the people themselves come up with the idea for some sort of a policy that needs to be passed. So then once that initiative is created and you've got a petition and people sign it and they say, yeah, this is a good idea, and you have enough votes, then it gets on a ballot. And the referendum is where the people vote on the idea directly. So this is almost like a pure democratic system, a democracy where everybody votes on all of the issues. This is where the people are actually voting on an issue rather than a representative doing that for them in the legislature. So the idea for the policy is called the initiative. The direct vote by the people themselves is called the referendum. A good example of that would be the SPLOST tax in the local option sales tax that we have here in Cobb County. The voters themselves vote to determine yes or no, we want to have a SPLOST, an extra penny additive tax for every dollar that's spent that goes to the school system. Another initiative and referendum that was done here in Georgia was a number of years back when different counties were voting on whether or not to allow alcohol sales on Sunday. So those would be the kinds of ideas that would come up for a referendum vote. All right, so it's where the people have a direct say-so. So here would be the initiative, right? So the initiative is this. And this is in some state, I believe it may have been in California, concerns the estate, or no, Washington state. Concerns the estate tax. This measure would repeal Washington state law imposing tax currently dedicated for the Education Legacy Trust Fund, blah, blah, blah. So this is the idea, the initiative, the act of voting yes or no would be the referendum. Okay, so this is giving more power to the people and taking it away from these powerful politicians. Okay, so that would be an example of progressive reform. Another incident where we see progressive reform giving more power to the people, the constituents, is with the recall vote. So this is a way that an elected official can be removed from office before their term is over. We're not talking about impeachment or anything like that. We're talking more at the local or the state level. And so this would be a recall vote where the people themselves would go back and vote whether or not to remove a person from office. Doesn't really happen very often, but that power is actually there. Okay, and we've already talked about the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment. So this is giving them the power for the people themselves to determine who will be their senators rather than the state legislatures making that decision. Okay, another progressive era reform would be to restrict child labor. And this is going to be putting in laws that restrict the age at which a child can work. Because if children are working in the factories, like this little boy over here, he's not in school. Like these kids here who are working in these mines. The Keating-Owens Act in 1916 is going to make child labor illegal. Now, later on, it's going to be declared unconstitutional, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But just know that child labor reform is going to come about. This child labor committee, they produce these pamphlets again with these very vivid images of these children who were working, and they pass it around among all of the senators and representatives to try to play on their emotions, sort of like what Jacob Riis was doing with how the other half lived with the poverty in the urban areas. So the Child Labor Committee is using these images to try to persuade the senators and the representatives to vote in favor of the Keating-Owens Act. And it worked. So the law was passed, making child labor illegal. Okay. Another court case that is going to come before the Supreme Court is Mueller versus Oregon. And in the state of Oregon, it was looking at whether or not women should have limits to the number of days or the number of hours that they work in a day because of what it might do to their bodies and hurt their ability to be mothers, etc. So look what the court said here. So it ruled that the ruling limited women to a 10-hour workday. So they're going to say that women can't be forced to work 12-hour shifts. At the most, they can only work for 10 hours. But look at the wording of the Supreme Court's ruling. All right. What does the court say about women? What is their role in society? So they have special roles as childbearers, therefore they can be protected. And this is a quote from the ruling, that women's physical structure and the performance of maternal functions place her at a disadvantage in the struggle for subsistence is obvious. This is especially true when the burdens of motherhood are upon her. So in other words, when she's pregnant. Even when they are not, by abundant testimony of the medical fraternity, continuance for a long time on her feet at work, repeating this from day to day tends to be injurious effects upon the body, and as healthy mothers are essential to the vigorous offspring and physical well-being of a woman becomes of public interest. Okay, so this is from the Brandeis brief. So the persuading factions that were trying to limit the number of hours that a woman could work in a day comes from this Brandeis brief. A brief in a court case is sort of like evidence that is being presented. And so they use this in the ruling. All right, now how could this actually, in the end, be very dangerous? What is the negative possibilities that could come out of this Brandeis brief or this argument that working all of these hours standing on their feet can hurt women and therefore they should have shorter work hours? What could be the danger of getting this ruling to shorten their work hours? Well, it's going to be saying that if you've got men and women, if you're trying to claim that men and women are equal to earn equal pay, to earn equal access to advancement or promotions in your job, then you've already got this foundation from the Brandeis brief that's saying that women and men are not equal because they are physically not equal. And so that was a dangerous argument, and it actually ends up being used against women later on when they start trying to argue for equality, like in voting and in other things. So this is problematic for women in the end, but it does get women shorter work hours that they had initially wanted in the factory system. All right, progressive reform doesn't always translate into access or better conditions for people who are not white or people who are not natives from the United States. So immigrants and African Americans don't experience any sort of protections or greater access to society like white Americans do. So progressivism is not truly beneficial to everybody. Okay. So we've got the Americanization process that we've talked about, the assimilation processes that we've talked about, and then certainly the segregation and the Jim Crow laws. So we mentioned the Plessy versus Ferguson before. And we want to get a little bit further into the arguments about the differences here between Plessy versus Ferguson, and this idea of separate but equal that really wasn't happening. Okay, the two main figures of the progressive era who are arguing that African Americans should absolutely be included in equality and access to greater opportunities as these progressive reforms were providing are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. You need to know these names. You need to know them thoroughly about what they are arguing. So Booker T. Washington is from the South. He grew up a slave and was a free man, obviously, after the Civil War. And he becomes the head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which is one of the Black colleges that opens during Reconstruction. He becomes the head of that, and it is an agricultural college, mechanical college that is teaching a trade, right? This vocational education that he is promoting at Tuskegee. And by vocational education, we're talking about not really going to college to learn to be a doctor or a lawyer or, something like that. Vocational education is learning a trade, learning a skill, whether it's farming or whether it's welding or whether it's, forging iron or whatever it may be. You would learn that at Tuskegee and then go out into the community, become a blacksmith or something like that. That is going to be a trade that people are going to be looking towards. So he argues that the best way for African Americans to gain equality is gradually over time. That if you force equality on these white Southerners who are adamantly opposed to it, then you're not going to get true acceptance until you, over time, prove that you are an upstanding, honest, hardworking, contributing member of the community. And at that point, you will actually gain true acceptance. So just legislate, you can't legislate equality, or you can legislate equality, but you can't legislate acceptance. True acceptance is what Booker T. Washington is arguing. So he's saying that over time, it will happen, but it's going to take hard work and being a productive member of society. So here he is giving these speeches before these huge audiences, but notice who's in the crowd, right? This is a white audience that he is largely speaking to. He also is the one who speaks at the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta. And this is known as the Atlanta Compromise speech. So 1895. And we're going to read a portion of this in class as well. So he is coming from Tuskegee to speak at the Cotton States Exposition, huge audience. And he's going to be talking about this idea of, assimilation over time. And he's saying that African Americans can fulfill all of these jobs as new industries are moving to the South, hire Black workers. And we can work together economically, but still stay socially segregated, at least, for a period of time, is what he's kind of saying. This is also coming out of arguments that he makes in his book, Up From Slavery. All right, so that's one perspective, and he is certainly a leader in the Black community. The other perspective in the Black community is coming from this man, W.E.B. Du Bois. His name looks like it would be a French name pronounced Dubois. It's not. He pronounced his name Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois is from Massachusetts. He has a law degree, I believe, from it's either Harvard or Yale. He's very well educated, and he is a good bit younger than Booker T. Washington. And so when Up From Slavery comes out, right, this book by Booker T. Washington and the speech from the Cotton States Exposition, W.E.B. Du Bois is furious. And he's like, why should there be any delay in equality that it was provided by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the 1860s? So why are we still arguing about this in the 1890s? Immediate equality has to be demanded right now. And he says this idea of a vocational education is selling yourself short if you're African American. And you should strive for a formal higher education and don't just settle for a vocational education. You can do more with your life. And he tries to focus on what he calls the talented 10th, which would be the most intelligent of the African American community, focus on them, getting them this high level of education to then go back into the Black community and uplift everybody else. So they both want the same thing. They both want equality, but the way they're going to go about it is different. Okay. So his book is called The Souls of Black Folk. And he argues, I mean, he calls out Booker T. Washington by name in this book and talks about how he is allowing segregation to be perpetuated and that this is a terrible way to approach a demand for equality. Du Bois actually does come to Atlanta later on in his career, and he becomes a professor at the Atlanta University. And I took a course one time with a professor at Georgia State, and we went to the Atlanta University campus, which is the part where W.E.B. Du Bois was a professor is no longer functioning, but it's kind of near Morehouse and Spelman. It's kind of in that area. And we sat in the courtyard, and where he's sitting at his desk here, looking outside the window, this is where he wrote The Souls of Black Folk. We read sections of The Souls of Black Folk sitting in that courtyard where he's looking out that window. And it was incredibly powerful to be there in that space, reading those words in that book from Du Bois. All right, so if we are looking at the differences here, look at these two quotes. So this is coming from the Souls of Black Folk. When Mr. Washington apologizes for injustice, he does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting. He belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinction and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brighter minds. We must unceasingly and firmly oppose him. But then Booker T. Washington, look at what he's saying. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly, and that progress in the enjoyment of all privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle rather than of artificial forcing. That true equality, true acceptance will come over time. So you've got two totally opposite approaches to the situation, and the Black community is split. I think we could definitely look at the backgrounds of each of these men and maybe look at why their point of view is what it is. Booker T. Washington, having been raised in the South, having experienced segregation and having experienced slavery in the way that he has, is completely different from the way that W.E.B. Du Bois was raised and the way that he was, the way that he lived and experienced. So we will be reading more of this as well in class and looking more closely at these two. Eventually, W.E.B. Du Bois is going to put together a group of individuals who are of like mind to him to demand immediate equality and to oppose Booker T. Washington's approach. And this is known as the Niagara Movement. And they are going to try to meet in New York. And they're banned. They're not allowed to host this meeting in New York City, which speaks to the fact that there's also segregation and racial issues in the North at the same time. So they cross over from Niagara Falls, they cross over into Canada, they have their meeting, and they're working at trying to develop this organization. And what prompts the organization to finally take hold and to gain a lot of acceptance and a lot of support is after the Niagara meeting. All right, so that took place in 1905. The following couple of years, race riots are breaking out. You've got the 1906 race riot in Atlanta, and then this bigger riot in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois. All right, a race riot in Atlanta, Georgia was not as shocking and unexpected as it would be in Springfield, Illinois. This is the hometown of Abraham Lincoln in the North. And so this race riot breaks out, and you can see the aftermath where these homes have been destroyed. And as a result, W.E.B. Du Bois is again calling for racial equality. And he gets a lot more support at this point after the race riot in Springfield. And so he forms the NAACP, which is an organization that does still exist today, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So again, make sure that you're clear that this organization is W.E.B. Du Bois. He is the founder of this organization, still going to be working for racial equality. Look at their symbol. These are those scales of justice that I talked about. And so this is going to remind us that the way that the NAACP is going to work is by working through the court system. So they're going to take on cases. They're going to try to drive home this idea of getting equality protected by the court system, the national courts and the Supreme Court. Another organization that forms is the Urban League, and this is looking at financial equality or economic equality in the urban areas. And I think an important part to remember is that this is also a turning point where more people are living in urban areas than ever before. Look at this graph. It's important that we begin to look at graphs and be able to interpret those. I find that students kind of have a hard time with interpreting data on a graph. So everything in yellow is talking about the proportion of the population that lives in an urban area, and the gray is the proportion of the population living in rural. So in 1800, so this would have been the time that Thomas Jefferson was elected, less than 10% of the population lived in cities. Over 90% of the population lived in rural areas. So again, this idea of agriculture and of farming and of rural politics, all of that's going to be dominant. But where we see this shift, so if we go to 50%, where it starts to change, and we come across here, and then we come down, look at the timing. So this would be in the 19 teens when we see this turning point, this transition to where more people live in urban areas than live in rural areas. And so that's going to be the importance here that is helping people with employment and housing and jobs and all of that in the urban areas. And the Urban League is going to be an agency that is responsible for that, does also still exist today. Another organization is the Anti-Defamation League. And this was an organization, and still is, that is looking at policies and protections for people against anti-Semitism and the equality, religious equality. Okay, so the Anti-Defamation League is responsible for that. All right, so now we get back and finish up our story here with Roosevelt and Taft. And we said that when Taft took over as president, he didn't necessarily fulfill the wishes that Roosevelt had wanted. He didn't maintain those policies. And we see here a clear distinction between the two. I would probably take a picture of this slide as well. So we've got the distinction over good trust and bad trust, where Taft is going to go after all of the trust. We've got the workers being supported here. We've got the Payne-Aldrich Act that it didn't lower the tariffs like the progressives had wanted. It's protecting the businesses. We've got regulation of the railroads. We've got the Meat Inspection Act. He's going to be a conservationist, not a preservationist. Well, guess what? Taft is going to be a preservationist. And so he fires the head of the U.S. Forest Service that Roosevelt had put in, Gifford Pinchot. It's this big scandal over firing him. And then the Republican Party is going to be split over who to support, because again, this is probably going to side with big business. Then you've got some of the Republicans who are going to side with Roosevelt. So Roosevelt comes in and he tells Taft, you're out of here, right? You're bungling up, you're making a mess of all of my policies here in the White House. And so I want my position back. And so when Taft comes up for re-election, Roosevelt assumes that Taft's going to step aside and allow him to get the Republican nomination. And Taft's like, no, not so fast, because I do have the backing of business here. And he refuses, right? So Roosevelt gets back from this safari. He is absolutely furious with Taft, and it starts this feud between these two politicians who had at one point been partners. So when he doesn't step aside and they're fighting over the nomination, Roosevelt says, okay, you can have the Republican nomination, but assuming that everything's going to work out as it always has for Theodore Roosevelt, he forms his own party. And his party is going to be called the Progressive Party. So think about what we're saying here. We know we're going to have a Democratic nominee. We've got Taft, who's going to become the Republican nominee and have the backing of business. But Roosevelt is going to start a third party that's called the Progressive Party. How well has third party nominations, how well has that worked in the past? Do you remember when we saw one before where we looked at the third party that actually, with Lewis Cass taking votes away, and it allows the opposite party to actually come in. That's what we're headed for. And Roosevelt's smart enough to see this, but Roosevelt is also arrogant enough to believe that everyone's going to vote for him because he's Theodore Roosevelt and everything has always worked out and he's popular and he's going to get all of these votes. So he starts the Progressive Party, and the nickname becomes the Bull Moose Party, and you'll see why in just a second. And so here we've got this cartoon, and it says he's delighted. Roosevelt kind of had this quirky way of talking, and he always exaggerated certain syllables. And so he's throwing his hat in the ring, and he is becoming the nominee. So the latest arrival to the political zoo, you've got the Republican who's Taft, you've got the Democrat donkey here who's going to end up being Woodrow Wilson, and then you've got Roosevelt, who is part of the Bull Moose Party. All right, so here's this power struggle over Republican votes, and Roosevelt, right, Teddyism is down here. Roosevelt's trying to pull these Republicans into the water with him. And then you've got the businessmen are trying to hold it back. There's Taft trying to hold back the Republicans, and they're fighting over these votes. And Roosevelt is claiming, right, this is a new nationalism. This is a new form of national government, and everyone needs to support him. In one of his campaign stops, he actually gets shot in the chest and doesn't die. All right, so he's campaigning, and he's got his speech, and it's rolled up, and it's in his coat pocket, and he's got his glasses case in the coat pocket, and he's walking, to the arena to give his speech, and a gunman comes out and shoots him in the chest, but the bullet goes through. So this speech had been folded up. The bullet goes through the glasses case, goes through the speech, which slows the bullet down just enough to where when it gets lodged in Roosevelt's chest, it doesn't actually go far enough to hit his heart. So he's bleeding profusely. He's not dead. And he goes ahead and gives his speech anyway. So again, this just kind of adds to the story of Theodore Roosevelt, an assassination attempt. He lives through it. He doesn't die, and he gives the speech anyway. So here's the bloody shirt where the blood's there. He kept his coat on while he was giving his speech. And so look at this statement. This is where the Bull Moose nickname comes from. And it says, fortunately, I had my manuscript. So you see, I was going to make a long speech, and there's a bullet. This is where the bullet went through. And it probably saved me from it going into my heart. The bullet is in me now so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best. So he gives the speech, and he says it's going to take a lot more than that to kill a bull moose, right? He's as stubborn, he's big as this large animal. And so that's kind of where it goes. It comes from. But again, he was in Milwaukee, and he still talked for an hour before he went to the hospital. So again, it just kind of adds to the lore. Also in this election of 1912, so we've got Taft, we've got the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, we've got Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party, and then we've also got the Socialist Party. Here's Eugene Debs, the guy who was the railroad labor union leader, who, when he got arrested for interfering with the mail delivery after the Pullman strike, and he became a socialist. Here he is running for president now in 1912. So the outcome of the election, there's the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, and he's going to basically say that he's going to bust the trust, but he's going to do so responsibly, not all of the trust, but just the bad trust. He's going to regulate the banking system, and he's going to have a reasonable tariff put in place. So a lot of these provisions kind of sound like what Roosevelt would have wanted. And so his approach here is the new freedom. So Woodrow Wilson, again, he used to be, prior to running for president, he was the president of Princeton University. He actually grew up, and part of his childhood, his father was a minister here in Augusta, Georgia, not terribly far from the Augusta National Golf Club where the Masters is played. His father was a minister, and that's where Woodrow Wilson enjoyed part of his childhood. So look at the outcome. Wilson wins in a landslide. He wins all of these states in the Electoral College. And it's because these votes were split. Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote. All of these areas in the North that we would typically associate with the Republican Party, they're splitting their votes. So if we drill down, because we know in the Electoral College, it's winner take all. So where it looks like New York went for the Democrat Wilson, you've got to kind of break down and drill down where these counties were voting, when actually, right, we see in New York a lot of blue, a lot of green over here. So we've got the votes that are being split between Taft and Roosevelt, which is allowing Wilson to slip in here and win the election. Okay, so we've got the Republican Party divided by the Bull Moose Party, which equals Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, becoming the new president of the United States. So Wilson comes in as the first Democratic president in a very, very long time. And that's going to be this final section of Chapter 19, where Wilson comes in, and we're only going to be looking at his domestic policy because he's going to be president during World War I. So this is only looking at his policies, his domestic policies within the United States. So he passes the Underwood tariff, which keeps the tariff, but it lowers it to a level that the Republicans in the Payne-Aldrich Act didn't like. And so he also is going to create that income tax using the amendment process, the 16th Amendment, to generate revenue. So if he's lowering the tariff, you've still got to have money coming in, right? Tariff is tax money to pay for programs in the United States. So if you cut the tariff, you've got less money coming in, where he's going to make up the difference by increasing the tax money, the income tax that's coming in on the wealthy. So it kind of balances out. So the 16th Amendment with the income tax and the lowering of the tariff with the Underwood tariff are going to still keep the economy, the amount of money coming in, the same. He's also going to transform the banking system, right? So this whole argument over free silver and the gold standard, we're going to change this, right? This new currency law is going to be set up that is going to set up the Federal Reserve System, where you've got the banks, the amount of money in circulation is determined by the Federal Reserve. This group of people who get together, they determine interest rates, they determine how much money should be in circulation, and it's going to be like fiat money. It's going to be not necessarily based on the value of gold and silver that the United States has in its treasury. It's going to be paper money that is based on the value that we believe that it has, and it's based on the amount of currency that's out there. So it's not redeemable in gold and silver. Okay, so this is a complicated system, and it is put in place under Wilson's administration. So his trust busting, if we were to align the trust busting here of Wilson, it would be more in line with Roosevelt's, where you have the good trust and the bad trust, where Taft went after every trust. And so he's going to more clearly define the Sherman Antitrust Act. So it's going to still be in place, but he's going to define more clearly exactly what the companies are allowed and are not allowed to do. And to oversee this is the Federal Trade Commission. So today, if you have a company that is engaging in selling stocks, the Federal Trade Commission is monitoring what those companies are doing. All right, so Wilson is not going to have a great reputation on race relations. So that's going to be one area where he definitely will differ from Roosevelt. So even though Roosevelt was a Republican, what we're kind of seeing is that he's acting sort of like a moderate Democrat. Where Roosevelt is, he does invite Booker T. Washington to the White House. He's also going to have a little bit better track record on race. Still not great, still not enforcing equality and ending segregation, but it's not as bad as what Wilson gets involved in. So Wilson is opposed to Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching laws. He's going to have segregation within his government offices. And then there's also this scandal where this terribly racist, horrible movie called Birth of a Nation comes out. And he has a private screening of it in the White House, where he's, one of the first people to watch the movie. And it's talking about the Klan, and the background of the Klan is depicted in this movie, Birth of a Nation. And Wilson is not going to condemn it. And so a lot of people in modern times are looking back at Wilson's reaction to Birth of a Nation. And they challenge that, and they challenge his efforts in terms of race relations. All right, so if we look at the achievements of progressive era reform, we could certainly make a great chart here with some comparisons. If we look at Taft and Roosevelt and Wilson, I think we could certainly align Roosevelt and Wilson kind of on the same page of progressive reform, and Taft is going to kind of go to the extreme. So, and then if we look at progressive reform, was it effective? This would make a great LEQ question. How effective were the progressive reforms? Well, you could talk about all of these different areas of political reform, of economic reform with the big businesses, but then one of your areas where you could say that progressive reform was lacking is in who is benefiting from progressive reform, that we definitely see a distinction between white Americans and the common white citizen and of the lower classes and their experience with progressive reform versus African Americans. And it's not the same, it's not equal. And so those types of evaluations would be important to include in any sort of essay related to this. All right, so there you have it, all of chapter 19, progressive reform. There is a lot happening here, so I hope that it has helped to explain many of these topics and concepts. So until next time, keep reading and go make history.